to the second PCC roundtable for spring semester 2018. Adam, Robert, and I, my name is Aaron Weiss, put together a series of 3 events to have discussions between students with faculty responding, orbiting some of the themes of a few of the classes being offered in the philosophy and religion program here this semester. And last month, was it? We had one on pluralism and cosmopolitics. Today's theme is philosophical inquiry as spiritual exercise. Professor Stephen Goodman in Asian Studies here at CIIS is teaching a course by that name this semester, which I have audited in the past. Adam Robert is writing a comprehensive exam on the work of Pierre Hadot, who is an important figure in the study of the interrelation of philosophy and spirituality in the ancient world and today. And I should give a plug for the next and final roundtable of this semester will be May 3rd. And what's the title of that one?
Religion and Metaphysics After Modernity.
Okay.
Metaphysics
after Modernity.
After Modernity.
And Jake will be the faculty respondent on that one.
And who will be the presenters?
We have Ashton Arnoldy from PCC, William Dowling here, and Millie in Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion. So the format for today is that Adam and I will share some remarks, basically as a way of sort of opening up a space for us all to dialogue. And Stephen will have his chance to respond to us before we open it up to the group. Is there any other?
Well, last time we had 3 respondents, so we had, or 3 student speakers, so we had the students speak, then we took a break, and then we heard the response, but so yeah, Dr. Sean Kelly sitting here. But there's just 2 of us today, so we may just go into Stephen's response and then take a break before we have a discussion, or we might take a break after Aaron and I speak, but we'll take a break at some point. We'll take the temperature when we're done and take it from there.
Okay. I present to you Adam Robert.
Okay. Thanks, Aaron. So, as Aaron mentioned, I'm going to be talking about Pierre Hadot. I'm going to say just a little bit about just a short piece on his biography, his basic approach to philosophy as a way of life, philosophy as spiritual exercise. I'm going to say a little bit about Socrates. Socrates is a big example for Hadot. He's very much sort of the figure of the philosopher that exemplifies some of these exercises that Hadot speaks about. Then I'm going to talk about 2 of these exercises in particular. One is what Hadot calls askesis, which is a kind of self-transformative practice or act. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about dialectics, both inner dialectics and the kind of Platonic dialectics that we see in the dialogues. And then I'll say a little bit about what this has to do with our ethical practices, our community responsibilities, and how this might relate to politics and things beyond our own personal lives. So a little bit about Hadot. He's a French philosopher and a historian of ancient philosophy. He's primarily working on the texts of Plato and Aristotle, but also a lot on Stoicism and Cynicism, Epicureanism, Neoplatonism. He taught at the Collège de France in Paris. And unfortunately, he just passed away in 2010. But he's written a lot of essays on Marcus Aurelius, Plotinus, Descartes, Kant, Wittgenstein, Merleau-Ponty, a lot of heavy hitters in the philosophical tradition. I'm going to put a lot of that kind of discussion and analysis to the side today and just focus on 2 of his main translated works. The first is What is Ancient Philosophy, which is in many ways his primary text, and the other is a collection of essays just called Philosophy as a Way of Life. So the central question in both of these texts is largely the same. The question is, what does it mean that philosophy is a way of life? The title of that first book, What is Ancient Philosophy, I think, in my opinion, could just be called What is Philosophy? He's trying to get at an answer to this question by studying ancient Greek texts, but it has everything to do with what we mean by philosophy today, I think. So what does Hadot think about this question? Philosophy, when done right, he thinks, has to involve our whole being. It means paying attention to our theoretical and intellectual beliefs, but it also means that we have to attend to our values, our feelings, and our practices. So in a lot of ways, it means that we have to make a commitment to paying attention to ourselves and develop a concern for those around us. So it's really a whole form of life. And Hadot's clear that this is an existential choice. So this has to involve all aspects of our life. It's a choice of life, but it's also a way that we make a life. So philosophy is a kind of self-making that issues out of our choice of philosophical practice. And so this is why Hadot says that philosophical discourse has to be understood from the perspective of the way of life it advocates for. So this is theory and practice conjoined, but it's not really theory on the one hand over here and then practice on the one hand over here. It's a theoretically informed practice, and it's a theoretical engagement that's transformative. So this is really the key to what Hadot's doing. It's the key to entering his reading of philosophy, and I think it's really the key to becoming a philosopher for oneself. So whatever else we might say about theory and practice, Hadot argues philosophy is first and foremost a question of self-transformation. And beyond a question of transformation, it's actually a kind of admission. It's an admission that from the beginning that we don't really know who we are or what we're about or where we're going or how we ought to act. So at the beginning then, philosophy is a question. It's not a question about how to recite this or that theoretical position, but about being able to place ourselves in question. So this is really one of Hadot's central arguments. Philosophy is about attending to oneself. It's a mode of self-examination. It's a practice of placing ourselves in question. So I'll share a quote from Hadot here. The philosophical act is not situated merely on the cognitive level, but on that of the self and of being. It is a conversion which turns our entire life upside down, changing the life of the person who goes through it. It raises the individual from an inauthentic condition of life, darkened by unconsciousness and harassed by worry, to an authentic state of life, in which he or she attains self-consciousness, an exact vision of the world, inner peace, and freedom. So the person that really exemplifies this position for Hadot the most is Socrates. And he's talking here about what he calls the figure of Socrates, which is part historical figure and part character that's been relayed to us through a variety of texts, but it's really this kind of aggregate figure that he's talking about, almost this mythic person of Socrates. And so he has a number of things to say about Socrates that I want to share with you that kind of exemplifies the shift in treating philosophy as a series of practices that he's interested in. He says, in other words, by passing from knowledge to himself, Socrates will begin to place himself in question. The point was thus not so much to question the apparent knowledge we think we have, as to question ourselves and the values which guide our own lives. So this is a questioning that sets the person at kind of a distance from themselves. They're placing themselves in question, where the real problem isn't if we know this or that, but if we are or are capable of being in this or that way. So this is how Hadot suggests that we think of philosophy. It's a series of exercises engaged for transforming ourselves and our perception. So he says philosophy is more about forming than informing. It's about achieving what he calls a mutation of vision or a conversion of attention. The insight being that perception is itself a kind of practice. It involves effort and work and trying again. It's some kind of a skill. Perception is a skill. Attention is a skill. And it's trainable. It's something we can get better at doing. And I want to dwell on this point just for a moment because Hadot wants us to take that idea literally, this idea of training and exercise. Philosophy is a spiritual exercise. So I want to share 2 more quotes from you just so you really get a sense for what he means. Hadot writes, "The notion of philosophical exercises has its roots in the ideal of athleticism and in the habitual practice of physical culture typical of the gymnasia. Just as the athlete gave new strength and form to his body by means of repeated bodily exercises, so the philosopher developed his strength of soul by means of philosophical exercises and transformed himself." Here's a second one. "Underlying this conviction that people can modify, transform, and realize themselves is the parallelism between physical and spiritual exercises. Just as, by dint of repeated physical exercises, athletes give new form and strength to their bodies, so the philosopher develops his strength of soul, modifies his inner climate, transforms his vision of the world, and finally his entire being. The analogy seems all the more self-evident in that the gymnasium, the place where physical exercises were practiced, was the same place where philosophy lessons were given. In other words, it was also the place for training in spiritual gymnastics." So Hadot is saying the philosopher is some kind of an athlete, some kind of a gymnast, something like this, maybe a contemplative athlete. But an athlete of what, really? What's actually going on here? It's a nice analogy, makes us sound cool. But an athlete of what? And I like Michel Foucault's response to this question, and he suggests that the ancient athlete, which is the philosopher, is an athlete of the event. Okay, what's an event? He just means that it's an athlete responsive to the unforeseeable conditions of life. So the event is what you don't expect. The event is what kind of jars you out of your regular habits, your comfort zones and spaces and things like that. And so this athlete is the person who can respond to the event with some kind of agility, some kind of skillful means is involved. So I'll quote Foucault again. It says, "The good athlete's training, then, must be training in some elementary moves which are sufficiently general and effective for them to be adaptive to every circumstance, and, on condition of their being sufficiently simple and well learned, for one to be able to make immediate use of them when the need arises." So I always find that when I'm reading texts about philosophical practice, I'm always sitting there going, okay, so what are the practices? And a lot of times they never seem to come. And one of the things I like about Hadot is that you actually do get a fairly good description of what these practices are. So I'm going to talk about askesis and dialectics, and you can get a sense more concretely for what a spiritual philosophical exercise looks like. So Foucault's talking about elementary moves. I might talk about this in terms of precursors to philosophical ability. And the central concept here again is askesis. I take it from Hadot. And askesis is related to ascetic or asceticism, both of which have to do with abstinence, deprivation, a lot of times a kind of severe self-discipline. Hadot doesn't mean it in exactly this way. He has a more general and kind of a little bit more of a forgiving understanding of askesis. And so when I use this term, I mean it in the same sense he does, which is just to refer to any intentional practice that produces a transformation in the person. So it's intentional, it's a practice, and it transforms. So Hadot notes that this could include diet or sleep, meditation, physical exercise, study, therapy, any number of things comes to mind. But Hadot says that there's a particular kind of askesis that's involved in philosophy, and it's a kind of spiritual practice that is at the center, according to Hadot, of all philosophical practice. And it's something we could call an askesis of the I. And he says this askesis constitutes the foundation of every spiritual exercise. It's a pretty broad claim. But he does suggest that, at least as far as Platonism, Pythagoreanism, Cynicism, Stoicism, Epicureanism, this does seem to hold true. And so he says all of these schools called for a kind of self-duplication in which the I refuses to be conflated with its desires and appetites, takes up a distance from the objects of its desires, and becomes aware of its powers to be detached from them. So, in simple terms, the askesis of the I just means becoming aware that you are a self, or at least that you seem to be a self that's moving through the world. You have a present, a past, a future. You're full of worries and doubts and expectations and desires. And so askesis in this sense is just a turning of attention onto that self. It's an attention to oneself, a sort of a sensing that one senses different things. And so Hadot says of this practice, these spiritual exercises almost always correspond to the movement by which the I concentrates upon itself and discovers that it is not what it had thought. It ceases to be conflated with the objects to which it had become attached. Okay, so that's very cool. But Hadot goes on to say that as soon as we notice this first kind of self that's being pulled in all of these different directions, kind of in an unexamined, unfree way, that this self actually starts to die. So in that sense, when you split yourself from yourself, that first self starts to kind of fade away. So that self that's constantly being pulled around is dying. And so this is where the saying that philosophy is learning to die comes from in this context. So we could say that first philosophy isn't metaphysics or aesthetics or ethics or epistemology, but a practice of an I learning to die. But what happens after death? If philosophy is learning to die, it's also about learning to live in the afterlife. If you've made the philosophical jump, then welcome. You're here with the rest of us in some kind of second life. As it turns out, once you die in this philosophical sense, a lot of things keep on happening. And these happenings are the arena within which what we normally think of as doing philosophy begins. Now, the emphasis on practice is essential here. This second life doesn't open up once and for all, but only insofar as our practices allow us to remember the conditions of our existence, or rather to remember the conditions of our own conditioning. Okay, so far this sounds like a lot of individual, isolated introspection, but that's not the end of the story. This askesis of the I is really related to what we're familiar with as a kind of Platonic dialectics. And so there's a kind of a dialectics of the self with itself, and then there's a kind of a dialectics of the self with another person. And it's through this process of the inner dialectic that we really start to learn what it takes to show up for another person in a kind of shared interpersonal dialectic. So philosophy requires both practices. The one lends strength to the other in what Hadot calls a kind of reciprocal causality. So for Plato and Hadot, philosophy is a dialogue. It's an inner and outer dialogue. And the point really is to carry out this conversation to achieve a kind of transcendence over oneself. And the dialogue is here another exercise of dying to one's beliefs. So I'll share a quote from Hadot on this point. This is why Platonic dialectics was not purely a logical exercise. Instead, it was a spiritual exercise which demanded that the interlocutors undergo an askesis, or self-transformation. It was not a matter of combat between two individuals, in which the more skillful person imposed his point of view, but a joint effort on the part of two interlocutors in accord with the rational demands of reasonable discourse, or the logos. So I know I'm running short on time here, so I'll just kind of speed through the rest of this. That first move...
There's really plenty of time, frankly. If you got an important point to make.
I have so many important points.
I know you do. I encourage you.
Any of us could die at any minute, though.
So start with the most important ones.
Okay.
No pressure.
So if we had this move from this kind of askesis of the I to an askesis in the dialectic, there's a third kind of askesis, which is a kind of an askesis with a community. And Hadot comes back to Socrates on this point as his example. And so again, he's saying that this activity is gonna tear you away from everyday life, from everyday customs. And if you're doing it right, you're gonna have some kind of a conversion moment or experience or something like that. And this conversion, Hadot thinks, is exemplified by Socrates. And so Socrates is set apart not just from himself and not just from the person he's dialoguing with, but also from Athenians in general. So Socrates is living in a different kind of space. He's a different kind of creature. So Hadot has some compelling descriptions of him that I'll share with you. He says of Socrates, he is a topos, meaning strange, extravagant, absurd, unclassifiable, disturbing, and that he's not at home either in the world of senseless people or the world of the sages, neither wholly in the world of men and women, nor wholly in the world of gods. He is an intermediary and a mediator. Socrates is a daimon, a mixture of divinity and humanity. So he's simultaneously in the world and outside of it. And he transcends both people and things through his moral demands and the engagements they require. Yet he is also intimately involved with people and with things because, as Hadot says, the only true philosophy lies in the everyday. So Socrates has a kind of a distance from his fellow Athenians, but he's also deeply involved with them. And so Hadot has this term that he uses in another context, which I quite like, which is redescension. And so there's this kind of move where Socrates is moving in and out of these different fields of activity, but if he's transcending them, he's also redescending back into them. And so he's living in this in-between world where habits and customs and representations of things can be reevaluated and refashioned. And Hadot says the sort of guiding light of all of this refashioning and questioning is always towards the good, some kind of a Platonic good, a better life. So Socrates is trying to share these practices and these questions, but what he's sharing is a kind of askesis. So the last point I'll make here is that with askesis, you get a kind of first philosophy it's really an integration of ethics and metaphysics and epistemology from the standpoint of the first person in an interesting way. So it's really always about one's own questioning and one's own articulation of these issues. And so what I like about this is that it means that askesis has to be about both knowledge and care. And so there's a therapeutic potential in this move that Foucault marks as a shift away from knowledge of the self to care of the self. So there's a moment in this practice where we can choose to construct our experiences differently, to intervene in the representations that inform our experience of the world, allowing us in some way to soften the otherwise strong grip the unexamined flow of representations, beliefs, and habits has upon us and our communities. But he's also clear that askesis is more than just a kind of moral pragmatism, and I'll quote Foucault one more time. Askesis is not, and basically never was, the effect of obedience to an authority like the law. In reality, askesis is a practice of truth. Askesis is not a way of subjecting the subject to the law. It is a way of binding him to the truth. So here Foucault links askesis with a certain conception of truth, or a practice of truth-saying, known as parrhesia. And so the philosopher, I'm saying, is a kind of parrhesiast, a subject who risks themselves to speak the truth. And so Socrates, again, is a good example here of somebody who risked themselves in their own life to share their own truth, their own askesis. So the takeaway is that askesis has to become a habit, and it's a kind of a dialectical work of confronting representations and evaluating their adequacy. It's a work that aims to create new and better representations, and more importantly, to create new possibilities for freedom within experience. So philosophy then, for Hadot and for myself, is a question of taking care of our own souls so that we can in turn take care of one another and our city. And really, at bottom, philosophy is a practice of converting new possibilities into experience. So are we going to do a couple questions and then move forward, or just move forward?
I think it's nice to have both there as a palette.
Yeah.
And then, so rather than just the Hadot Foucault meal, more of a smorgasbord. But I'm only the respondent, so you guys are in charge.
Well, let's go on there.
Let's go on.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for that. That was a very helpful orientation to this conversation. Is philosophy really a way of life? I mean, that's what's at stake here. I think one of the reasons that it's worthwhile to be here in this conversation is because it is not established for most people that philosophy is a way of life. That's what makes Hadot and Foucault and related thinkers interesting, is that they're recovering the sense or the possibility of philosophy as a way of life. Because the standard image of philosophy today, of a philosopher, is of an academic, right? Somebody whose job is to know things. And specifically, philosophy is generally associated these days with the merely theoretical as opposed to the practical. And so the most common question a philosophy student hears is, what are you going to do with that? Okay. But the ancient well springs of philosophy, as explicated by thinkers like Hadot and Foucault and others, is a spiritual culture, a community of praxis in which fellow travelers on the path of wisdom engage in practices of self-care and self-knowledge for the benefit and transformation of themselves and the larger society. Now, philosophical inquiry as spiritual exercise, or its converse, spiritual exercise as philosophical inquiry, involves a perspective, as Adam mentioned, on the relation between the subject and truth. And in his lecture series on this topic, published as The Hermeneutics of the Subject, Michel Foucault outlines the interrelated history of philosophy and spirituality in terms of this question of the relation of the subject and truth. Within the historical framework of ancient Greece and the Hellenistic and Roman periods up to the appearance of Christianity. And in his initial sort of schematic, sort of summary overview remarks, he makes some helpful definitions of terms that I want to share with you. He says, we will call philosophy the form of thought that asks what it is that enables the subject to have access to the truth, and which attempts to determine the conditions and limits of the subject's access to truth. Okay? Now, he says, if we call that philosophy, then what we should call spirituality is the search, the practice, and the experience through which the subject carries out necessary transformations on himself in order to have access to the truth. Okay? So spirituality is those practices, and so those could be purifications, ascetic exercises, renunciations, conversions of looking, modifications of existence, etc., which are not for knowledge, but for the subject's very being, the price to be paid for access to the truth. Now, in the ancient world, it was presupposed that the subject, as such, does not have the capability or even the right to truth as it is. Okay? Now, Foucault here, he says, "For as he is, the subject is not capable of truth. I think that this is the simplest but most fundamental formula by which spirituality can be defined. It follows from this point of view that there can be no truth without a conversion or transformation of the subject." Okay. Now we can get back into some of the details on that, which Adam already started, but I want to add a new point here that hasn't been raised so much, and that relates to my opening question: is philosophy really a way of life today? See, for Foucault, the history of truth enters its modern period when it is assumed that the condition of the subject's access to truth is knowledge alone. Okay? I'll quote him. He says, "I think the modern age of the history of truth begins when knowledge itself and knowledge alone gives access to the truth. That is to say, it is when the philosopher can recognize the truth and have access to it in himself and solely through his activity of knowing, without anything else being demanded of him and without him having to change or alter his being as subject." And so Foucault summarizes that as the Cartesian moment, although he's careful to say that Descartes didn't invent it, and this kind of change didn't occur all because of one person or at one moment. But I think it's important to raise that point of a kind of historic rift in the history of philosophy that demarcates the ancient or the traditional forms of philosophy from the modern ones. So there's a difference here between the subject, knowledge, and truth. And askesis has to do with the subject's relation to truth. I don't know, I'd like to explore that with all of you here. Knowledge and truth as a kind of distinction here. So I want to suggest that these insights are of deep importance for those of us who wish to dialogue with traditional ways of thought. A lot of times we might think of traditional cultures in terms of their beliefs and worldviews. And so we might think about how those worldviews or specific matters of doctrine are borne out by, say, modern science, etc. But I think a lot of what's at stake in recovering or dialoguing with traditional philosophy is recognizing this context of practices which are generative of philosophical insight. And I think it's fair to say that traditional philosophy, or pre-modern ancient classical philosophy, thematizes this more directly and specifically than this sort of modern tendency. So just as Adam was giving some examples from the ancient Greek tradition, I can give some examples from traditions of Indian Buddhism, which are strikingly similar in many respects to a lot of the practices that Hadot and Foucault describe in terms of training the mind or purifying the personality. Let me see here. You have the, okay. 12 minutes. Okay. Now, in the general traditions of Indian Buddhism, enlightenment is attained through engaging in 3 higher trainings, the Trishiksha. The first is called Shila, which would be sort of discipline, moral discipline. The second is Samadhi, which is concentration or all various forms of meditation. And then Prajna is the third, which would be translated as insight. And so now starting with Shila, that involves all different forms of restraint of body and speech. And that would include all the various kinds of moral precepts that you might take as a lay person or as a monastic person. And this has been described as simplifying one's life. And then from there, having simplified one's life, then one has the time and the sort of mental space to practice and attain states of concentration. I think this is where sort of the athleticism starts to come in here. But then there's a third, and that relates to themes of mindfulness, concentration, etc., classic Buddhist themes from the Eightfold Path. And then the third training is prajna, which would encompass all forms of study and reflection into the true nature of reality, and is most associated with what the Buddhists call right view and right intention. Now, I just want to point out here that the analogy with athleticism seems to break down with the Buddhist notion of prajna. An athlete trains and builds habits and strengthens muscles, as it were, until, in the case of meditation, you become proficient in the control of your states of mind and perception and attention and all those kinds of things that you were talking about. But that isn't what leads to enlightenment. There's some other sort of, there's some other. And that reminds me of a point that Foucault made, actually, about these conversions of the self or transformations of the subject. He said in the ancient world, he's talking about ancient Greece, etc., he says the transformation occurs in 2 ways. One is askesis, which is this work done on the self, a lot of the themes that you raised. But then a second one he names is eros, which I think is important to bring up here. He defines that as a movement that removes the subject from his current status and condition. Either an ascending movement of the subject himself, or else a movement by which the truth comes to him and enlightens him. And so that's something that it seems is not really under the control of a kind of athletic discipline, but something that emerges, I don't know, that sort of interrupts it, you might say.
Unless it's the Kama Sutra.
Right, okay, good. Yeah. So I guess all this to say, I'd like to raise the question of soteriology in this conversation, which hasn't been raised so far. It becomes very important in Christian versions of these practices. Let me just think about what else I might want to say. I've got a lot of various sort of points and notes, but I'm eager to just get to kind of dialogue with everybody here.
Can you remind us what soteriology is?
Soteriology would be doctrines regarding salvation. I suppose the word is most strongly associated with Christianity, but I think Buddhism warrants use of that term because we talk about liberation from the cycle of birth and death and re-death. So Buddhists are not interested in simply attuning to the world. There's an important sense in which the world is involves a state that we wish to sort of escape from. So I'd like to kind of just note that. I think it's something like that in very generic terms might be true of Christianity as well. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about those things.
So, what's your sense of timing, format, break? I mean, we don't want to tax you too much before you take a break.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how everybody else
Take a break.
chime in. No, if everybody else is fine, and if it's fresh, if your bow is drawn, or whatever.
I have Sagittarius rising, so it's always.
I know, it's true. It's a ridiculous question for you. But if you're ready to respond, it'd be nice to hear.
Oh yeah.
Then we could break and there could be more dialogue. Or
So it's 3:51, so we could easily go till 4:30. I mean, I have a series of questions. I labeled them Q sub-0 through Q5. So points, they're not mutually exclusive, but they were sort of triggered. I want to give credit where credit is due. The first incarnation of this course that I'm doing this semester was with my beloved colleague Jake Sherman 2 years ago, but who knows, where we did a course which I myself learned a tremendous amount from it. It was kind of a packed audience for it. Philosophical inquiry of spiritual practice. The texts were, quote, Western and, quote, Eastern or Buddhist, and conjunctions, disjunctions, and we had a good time. And I tried to get him to teach it again this semester, but he said, alas, I'm already committed. So I did my version, and here we are. And shout out for those of you who have an opening in your schedule next Wednesday from 6 to 9, Professor Sherman will be holding forth on Nicholas Okuza's somewhat short text called
Divisione Dei.
Dayton, Divisione Dei, yeah. And there's a nice translation of it, and it's quite compelling. I just gave it to my class. So that's a shout out for next week from 6 to 9. Okay, into it. Q sub-0. Question sub-0. Know thyself. Okay. Plato tells us Socrates wrote lots of stuff. And people have isolated one phrase associated with him. And I should remember, I don't think it's in Phaedrus. Anybody remember what dialogue that's in?
it's in the apology.
Yeah.
It's in the apology.
Apology, okay. So know thyself. When Adam was putting forth in a bit, Aaron, talk about the self, I thought just to muse and to ask you guys, and then all the stuff will be open to you guys and gals who are here. Question: in some sense, can we hear the Socratic know thyself as a call to care for the self? Can knowing be a call to care? That's number one on that. Number two, Hegel was not mentioned, although Hadot wrote about Hegel. And Hegel sort of made more problematic the Socratic dictum, know thyself, but we only know ourself, this is Hegel, in relationship to the world, and we only know the world in relationship to ourselves. So the third point on this about know thyself is there some sense in the ancient world, and I'm focusing on Hadot, but this could be on the Indian Buddhist side too. Can we imagine a slogan which so far does not exist? I haven't discovered it. Knowing and caring the same. Now that might cause a remembrance of the pre-Socratic eighth fragment of Parmenides, where he said, knowing and being, or rather being and knowing the same, which has vexed philosophers. But the being and knowing the same, the ontological dimension and the epistemological dimension, we might imagine there was a time when it was the same thing, where there were ways into seeing how it was the same before they separated. So that's just questions and musings, questions about know thyself. In, I forget which of those two books, I'm using both of them. Hadot, it's in translation, but it comes across, talks about his use of the term spiritual, which we haven't really talked about as such. And he said, some people might object to my use of the term spiritual. And then he imagines a series of objections. It's just a technique, it's an exercise. And he said, well, but I'm imagining something a little bit different. So that's to ask about spiritual. And then if we ask about spiritual exercise, a question I have, slightly different. What do we know about the expression in English, Latin, Greek, of the history of the phrase spiritual exercise in Western or Christian traditions? And what's presumed in the notion of spiritual? It would seem, and I could be wrong, but it would seem that of the term spiritual and exercise, the foremost place is that of spiritual. There might be agreement, and then there might be a question about exercise. I can imagine in the gymnasium or in martial arts, maybe you start with exercise and you get at the end that it was spiritual. But I wanted to read something from perhaps the most well-known Christian example of spiritual exercise is St. Ignatius. And it just says here, the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, Catholic, are a compilation of meditations, prayers, and contemplative practices. Little footnote, because it says and, it's not necessarily the same, and there are nuanced differences between meditation and prayers and contemplation. They were developed to help people deepen their relationship with God. So, a question that I have at some point is spiritual exercise, spiritual exercise. So what? What's now? As Aaron said, maybe in a Buddhist context, there's a soteriological thing. I didn't hear that too much at Hadot. Foucault, we heard it a little bit. The truth, but maybe there's a more international sense of the emergence of truth through exercise. It says for centuries these exercises were most commonly given as what was called in the tradition a long retreat of 30 days in solitude and silence. So in the ancient world, I don't know if Hadot can even tell us, what the heck were people doing that might be called a spiritual exercise? And then even what do we know about what the heck was going on in the gymnasium? What were they doing? Were they just pumping it up? Or was there a kind of relationship to what they also were doing as philosophers? And that would be good to know. Then finally, just as a sense of St. Ignatius, the most common way of going through the exercises these days this quote, retreat in daily life. Month-long program of daily prayer and meetings with a spiritual director. Neither in your presentation of Hadot nor in Aaron's about Indian Buddhism, etc., nor Foucault, though it's there, is we know we don't do it alone, but what about the importance or not of a mentor? Not just like maybe in gymnastics, somebody spotting you. And there's the notion in the Buddhist traditions of the spiritual friend, which doesn't mean just a buddy, he or she, but one, they say, who is working with and knows the difference between wholesome and unwholesome actions, which is defined soteriologically. Wholesome are those actions which ease the way toward nirvana, peace, liberation. Unwholesome are ways that may block it. Okay? So what's the role, if any, and what is Foucault, what is Hadot, what do any of those people say about that? Zooming along, in what way can one imagine, or was it imagined in the ancient world, that spiritual exercises were not techniques? And this gets into the distinction well known to us, I guess, between the search for a way rather than a set of things toward wisdom. So philosophia, as opposed to here's a spiritual exercise, and in this spiritual exercise workshop you will achieve Sophia at the end and get a certificate. You know, the so-called sophists, right? And embedded in that, and I mentioned this before, what about intention? What's the goal of such exercises? And again, you know, if we inquire the ancient world or Buddhism, what can we find out about that? This habit, gaining a habit or deconstructing habits, brings to mind another Hegelian thing, which could be brought in here, the so-called Aufheben, sublation or synthesis, overcoming opposites by incorporation into a new place. In what sense can working with exercising be that? Finally, I'd like to end talking fast because I'm going to get all this stuff in. End with two things. One, there's a French philosopher who I think is no longer practicing philosophy, who trained with, directly I believe, Hadot. His name is Fabrice Midal, M-I-D-A-L. And Midal did an astounding work. He somehow felt that the work of Hadot opened him up to a kind of radical, if not to say holistic interpretation of kind of a seemingly wild renegade Tibetan Buddhist who had established a bunch of stuff in the United States, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And he wrote a biography of him. He never met him, he passed away. And his approach was so unique that the holders of all of the archives, which are considerable for Trungpa Rinpoche, they totally opened them up to him. And he tried to present a kind of unified picture of an intellectual, aesthetic seeker and explorer in a European mode. And so that's like a biography, which is not the way in which he's sort of appropriated in the United States. So somehow Hadot was kind of catalytic. I want to end with a sequence. In a way, Aaron was kind of hinting at it. There's a very famous work that's looked at today that has the idea of a way, an exercise. The Sanskrit word is charya, of a text by Shantideva called the Bodhicharya, the exercise of wakefulness. And it's said to be an avatara, an entry into that. It's a manual. with practices. And it was 8th century, and in many places in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, it's studied very much, and people do these things, and they're enumerated. How to work with emotion, etc., etc. So this word charya, C-A-R-Y-A, has a prominent place in a sequence, and I'll end with this, in a schema which kind of represents, we might say, the entire path, including intention, of what's involved, at least from a Mahayana point of view. And the sequences, there's fourfold. There's view. Where are you going? So that's intention stuff. Then there's meditation. I'll come back to that in a second. So you're deepening that view. Then there's, and it said these have to entail the next one, or it's not right. Then there's action. So if there's action or conduct or putting into practice without having deepened a view, it's just some sort of amusing Tourette's dance. You know, it's not clear what kind of, which is not to diss those with Tourette's. It's not clear that there's a lot of philosophically informed action. So view, meditation, conduct, and then finally result. So not conduct for conduct's sake, but the idea is, or I might say the reality, because people actually practice this, is that you want to get to the result, which is being free of habitual, self-centered, unthought through notions about what it is to lead a meaningful life. And that might be rejecting this world, going to another, or radically, there are traditions that say you vow to realize that feelings about this world and another world are just that, opinions. And that this world, with all the hopes and fears, is the ground, it's the salvational ground, and any attempt to go beyond that is an avoidance of spiritual bypass. And without working with the painful circumstances of how things are, we can't call it a nirvana worthy of the name. And I'll end with a quote on that. From Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Vietnamese poet and writer. He said, he vows to never be reborn where there's not suffering. Suffering is the ground. So anyway, those are a few thoughts.
So to know the self, gnote seo tone, right? And then there's this other phrase, care of the self, epimelia how tone. I don't know Greek.
Well, I thought it was suitcase.
Teotone, thank you.
Hey.
Heotone,
Oh,
okay.
that one, but it's care of the soul.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so you said, is knowledge an invitation to care? And
Or could it be the same? Could it be seen as the
sure.
same? That was my sense.
And that is related to some of these historical points that Foucault and Hadot are explicating. Know thyself initially was a phrase that related to accessing or seeking advice from the Delphic oracle.
Mm-hmm.
And in that context, people think that it meant something like, know your limits, don't ask too much, etc. But know thyself in the sense of coming to have some deeper insight. Foucault, I know for sure, says that it's important to recognize that care of the self was the context within which knowing the self can occur. And that also comes through in your examples from the Christian traditions of spiritual exercise, which are directly related to the ancient ones. So it's not that they're the same, but the idea is that they're always related. So the question, how do we know, or what is it to know, is always related in the ancient context by Foucault's claim to this question: what are the practices I can do to transform myself with relation to the truth? Those questions are always sort of correlated, and it's the kind of disjunction of those two themes which characterizes the modern period for Foucault. So it's really important, I think, to get the whole force of this, to recognize that they're profoundly interrelated. So it's not only that knowledge is a call to caring, but that it presupposes caring. Okay, so that was something I wanted to say.
Is there a
about
sense, I mean, just coming back for a sec, is it okay? It's called
Please.
Dialogue.
Yeah.
Just to push it, and it might just break and not be there. Knowing and caring the same. Now, you gave a nice example, which I think is historically accurate, of how a context for knowing, you know, it's supported. But if we pushed it, and it might be, I had a German teacher who said, "I just want you to know there's such a thing as a wrong question." Maybe it's a wrong question, but can you imagine, imaginatively or actually historically, notions of the ancient world or modern, where there's a kind of knowing which is caring?
Well, in Alcibiades, which is one of Foucault's favorite texts, it puts care of the self in the context of attaining the right capacity or position to be able to govern. And that, you know, you touched on that with your whole relation to the city. A crucial relation to the city is governing it. And so these processes of self-cultivation are required for that. And so you can think of that as a kind of caring, but I don't know in terms of citing the literature
That's helpful.
beyond that Alcibiades, if I'm even saying that right. Okay. When you read and don't talk about Greek stuff, you risk weird pronunciation. Try to think of other things, but did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I had a few things, actually a couple on what you had to say.
Sure.
And one of the first things you brought up was that eros seemed to be missing from my presentation, but it's certainly not missing from Hadot. And he's pretty clear at the beginning that if there's something like an organizing dynamic behind philosophy, it's eros. And so behind whatever philosophy is, it's constellated by eros as love of wisdom. And as I have said too many times already, he says that Socrates is eros. Socrates does exemplify this love of wisdom. Socrates knows he's not wise, but he loves wisdom, and in loving wisdom, he maybe can partake of some of it. So it's definitely there for Hadot. Eros, I think, also probably has a lot of important relations with askesis, especially if you're talking about training or these more kind of explicitly ascetic, difficult, hard, grinding kind of privation practices. A little eros will go a long way. And the second point I wanted to make, I thought it was interesting because you were talking about different Tibetan Buddhist practices. You listed 3, and I missed the official names, but two of them, one of them had to do with kind of training through askesis, through repetition, as a way of gaining insight or wisdom. And then another was a reflection into the nature of being. And you were saying that these are very different, and that just the act of repetition and training won't get you there.
Right.
And so maybe this athletic metaphor runs into some limits, but I actually think the athletic metaphor works really well in that context, because if you play a sport and you'll engage in a lot of cross-training and a lot of conditioning and a lot of drilling that isn't the actual sport, but it strengthens the things you need to perform. So you do all of these practices, but then when you actually engage in the performance, if you're doing that, you're going to do really poorly.
Right.
So I think there's a sense that askesis is training you up, but once you get to actually some kind of performative phase of this thing, you have to let those kind of training wheels go.
You quoted the term, I think, the unexpected event.
Right.
And so you might imagine that
Yes.
askesis has the, you're going through the forms, you're doing the push-ups or whatever, and then there's, I don't know, combat, or
That's right.
there's a kind of, or a race,
Yeah.
and all kinds of unexpected things happen. But I'm not sure in the gymnasium if that, is part of it. I have no idea.
Well, there are a lot of contemporary examples. I'm interested in martial arts and combat sports, and there are plenty of examples of people who do kind of very abstract drills and then get thrown into a live sparring situation, and it's just a disaster. They've never actually tried to respond in real time to the event, which in this case is another human. So I thought that was kind of worth thinking about. And then on this question of know thyself, I was going to go exactly where Aaron went with that, which I think is the right place. The only thing I would add is that this is this askesis of the I that I was talking about. It's really related to this question, know thyself. And I actually have a quote from Hadot about know thyself here, and he says, "Although it is difficult to be sure of the original meaning of this formula, this much is clear. It invites us to establish a relationship of the self to the self." So he's thinking about that. And in terms of knowing and caring, for Hadot, the only kind of knowledge is knowing how. Know how. So if knowledge is know how, it connects to care in the sense that you have to know how to care for somebody. And so I think a lot about what our friend Sam Mickey talks about in terms of tact, having a sense of tact when relating to another person. So know-how is kind of caught up in this question of tact. Tact is caught up in this question of caring. So yeah, I like knowledge and care together. And you can kind of imagine, I think, Foucault highlights Descartes as this moment, or this kind of caricature or stereotype where the care kind of falls away and knowledge kind of comes to the foreground. And you can easily imagine that image, but I'm wondering if you can also imagine the reverse image. Just full care, no knowledge seems equally disastrous. I can't think of a good example right now, but
here's an example.
Any number of New Age figures
not
come
New
to mind.
Age. There's a again, it was probably on the books by the 6th century AD, and again the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, where they say, look, we got these two terms. We have wisdom or knowledge, prajna, and then we have this thing called compassion. And it said, so let's imagine compassion's on the care side and knowledge is on the other side. It said, but in practice, if you are cultivating, if you could, a kind of knowledge or wisdom devoid of compassion, we'll say what that is in a second, then that's a dry, perhaps even destructive, and perhaps nihilistic or metaphysical entangling. So we want to say that it has to be suffused with compassion, or compassion narrowly means increasingly having the capacity to be present come with the passions and upset and pain of others. And it doesn't wreck your day, it actually weirdly enhances it, because you're beginning to discover alchemically that in working with difficult things, people in therapy maybe know this, sometimes there's a kind of emergent realization in the context of deep, intimate caring that you get a certain kind of knowledge. So then we're not so phobic, maybe. And they say, but if you have this, if you're cultivating compassion, but it's not suffused with a kind of wisdom insight into the way things are. This is a kind of sentimentality, and which is bad because it's not fostering a sense of openness from a wisdom point of view. So anyway, that's just, they thematize that early on, and of course, I long ago adopted the lady of the man doth protest too much way of reading ancient texts. If they're really emphasizing how important compassion is, it's probably that a lot of people were doing stuff that they didn't think was compassionate, you know.
Yeah.
So I think it was an issue, so thanks
Right.
for that.
It makes me think that, well, one way of restating what you just said is that care has some kind of important epistemological value.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's not
Yeah.
even just that you need to have good
Yeah.
knowledge and good know-how and then also care,
Yeah.
but that the care actually yields a kind of epistemological access that you don't get
That's right.
otherwise.
A turbo,
Yeah.
just real quick, a turbo version of that, in a big book by one of my favorite philosophers, Arthur Nussbaum,
Mhm.
wrote a book on emotion, really looking at the Stoics,
Yeah.
and she called it upheaval of thought.
Mhm.
And she said there's a thread from the ancient Greeks onward that, contrary to some other threads that say emotion is bad, it's a derangement of reason, the Enlightenment gave us that, it's madness, it's all bad. There's cognitive content, there's epistemological energy in emotion. And then, of course, well, okay, then your guys' question is kind of like, so what? Or like, how do you work with that?
Or which emotions?
And which emotions?
So existentialists like to focus on boredom and anxiety.
Yeah.
But we could talk about compassion as an ontological attitude, which is something
Right.
I've been trying to work on for years, actually.
That's great. So anyway,
Well, it goes back to why Hadot uses the term spiritual, and in that passage, I think I have the one you're thinking of right here.
where's he imagining?
What's that?
Where he's imagining objections to that?
Imagining objections, and why didn't I use psychic, moral, ethical,
Yeah.
intellectual,
Right.
of thought, of the soul, thought exercises, ethical exercises, therapeutic exercises. He runs through this whole list of why each of those is not the right term and why spiritual is the right term. The idea being that in some way, all of those concerns are taken up in the spiritual exercise. So it's not about thought or ethics.
Right.
It's not about knowledge or care.
Mhm.
It's in some way about this whole kind of constellation together.
So I appreciated what you said about Socrates being himself Eros. I think it's in the Apology, right, where it's said that Socrates was sent by the gods to the Athenians. I think that's right, in the Apology. But what was he sent to do? Like you said, he's not a sage. He was sent to get people to think about themselves and care about themselves and cultivate themselves. So that's fascinating. That's linking to that kind of eros where the truth is coming to you and transforming you. And so Socrates is doing that, but he's doing that by way of teaching this path of cultivation, which is interesting because we're not talking about developing a kind of doctrine.
Mhm.
That's something I said at the outset, which is that when we're trying to dialogue with traditional cultures, I think it's really profound and illuminating to think of it in terms of coming into dialogue or establishing dialogue between communities of practice. I have two questions. One is it that spiritual practices lead to a certain doctrine? Another is, can they be thought of as applications of a certain doctrine? It's not clear to me that spiritual practice has to be an application of a doctrine.
I think you find both responses
Uh-huh.
in the literature. Of course, I'm projecting like mad on notions of what doctrine might mean. And I'm remembering the ancient Greek distinction between doxa,
Mhm.
D-O-X-A, which people say is belief or opinion,
Yeah.
and knowledge or wisdom, Sophia.
Right.
And we even have modern people writing about Buddhist philosophy, calling Buddhist philosophers doxographers, those who put forth the beliefs of those people.
So I wanted to give an example from Tibetan tradition that I learned about from Jeffrey Hopkins, or a perspective of his, in a book he put together called Tantric Techniques, which I strongly recommend to everybody here who's interested in those traditions. It's a very heady and difficult book, but it's good. And he says, there's doxographical systems that say, well, there's the Yogacara system, and then above that is Madhyamaka, or something like that.
Mind
There's
only.
mind only, and then the middle way, and the middle way is supposed to be superior, or something like that. So you've got like the Sautrantika school, then the Yogacara school, and the Madhyamaka school as a kind of progression, and it can seem very neat and tidy and linear when it's laid out by the Buddhist doxographers. But what Hopkins tries to say is that is a kind of retroactive smoothing of what was in fact a profoundly jagged experience of a deep sort of paradigm shift at the level of one's personality. That one practiced as a practitioner of the middle way, doing certain kinds of meditation, and then you come out of that with a totally reformed sense of what the Yogacara teachings are about, and a whole new sort of view sort of emerges there in a non-linear process. The practices lead to a shift in one's perspective. So it's not exactly building an argument,
Right.
but there's a relay between the theory and the practice.
What's great about you bringing that up is, and again, we can ask about spiritual exercises and physical in the ancient world. There's a whole sense, which we didn't talk about, but not Aaron's mentioned it, called stages on the path.
Right.
And it's not the case that you have a view, and then you meditate, and then you try to put it into action, you get someplace, and then like you do your best, and then maybe somebody says, oh, so-and-so is enlightened. There's actually very detailed, it's called maps of consciousness, and maybe it's overly systematizing, but they say that, for instance, for Mahayana, the Bodhisattva, there's 10 stages. And they actually say, what's the insight and what are the signs that you've stabilized it? Mm-hmm. And then what emotions can occur. One of the last emotions to go is anger and pride. So you're really getting a lot of insight, but you might feel kind of superior. And they say a moment of anger in an advanced spiritual practitioner, according to these traditions, does much more harm to living beings than just the ordinary anger of a hoi polloi. And so there's that literature, it's been looked at a bit. I don't know what we have in the West, Christian or otherwise, that talk about different stages. Of course, in Hindu tantric and other things, we do have these stages. So in a way, it's back to what Adam was saying. There's different events you're actually putting into practice, so that the know-how, what you're knowing and how you're knowing it, the it changes. We might say dialectically.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's a very useful thing to say.
Foucault and Deleuze had an interview together that's published in a book called Language, Countermemory, and Practice. It's called Intellectuals and Power. And that's where I got this word relaying. They talk about the relation of theories and practices as relays. So the way it's put is that there is not a relationship of similarity between theories and practices. Practices are a kind of non-signifying or non-theoretic way of moving from theory to theory. I think that's a pretty interesting idea in the context of meditation practices and the stages of the view and all of those kinds of developments in,
That's very
in the
helpful.
Buddhist side.
Aaron will know this. A common, it's not in the Sanskrit, but it's in the Tibetan literature, a common way of construing one Tibetan word for meditation, gom, S-G-O-M, is habituation.
Right.
Kom.
Yeah.
And when I heard that, I went like, wow. And I said to one of my teachers, what do you mean? He just looked at me like I was, you just practice, just do it. Just sit, and it's not like, well, sit until you got the central insight, and it's just like, no, just sit, just shut up and sit.
Practice is enlightenment, Dogen.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. So yeah, exactly on that.
So I have something about Hegel here, but if it's not Hegel time.
It's always Hegel time. Well, I could say just quickly because
Sean said.
I was thinking about just to round out the picture of Hadot. He does have after he starts talking about this askesis of the I, he starts talking about world conception and the I and the all, and the relationship between different practices of I and realizations of the all. So those definitely get bound up in this discussion.
That's important.
So I have a sentence. This is funny because the hermeneutics of the subject is the published name of a lecture series that Foucault gave. And the research that he did on the ancient world and these spiritual exercises and care of the self actually led to his multi-volume works on the history of sexuality. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. He ends up developing this notion that I wanted to get to of technologies of the self.
Oh yeah.
And then in the Tibetan context, Matthew Kapstein has talked about sadhana liturgy practices as Tibetan technologies of the self. Anyway, that's an aside just about the context. This is the last sentence of that lecture series for the year. So here it goes. If this really is the problem of Western philosophy, how can the world be the object of knowledge and at the same time the place of the subject's test, right? If it can be both of those, how can there be a subject of knowledge which takes the world as object through a techne, and a subject of self-experience which takes this same world but in the radically different form of the place of its test? Are you holding this question in mind?
Yeah.
He said, if this is really the challenge of Western philosophy, you will see why the phenomenology of spirit is the summit of this philosophy. That's all for this year. Thank you.
So
He ends it with that, which I
So
thought was great.
that's reminiscent of we only know the self in relationship to the world and the world in relationship to the self. Phenomenology of spirit, read the preface as many times as you can. Are Sean and I the only sort of unabashed, completely out of the closet, besotted Hegelian lovers in this room?
That's a trap, because if you say
No.
no,
Jake's pretty close.
I read my Hegel.
I read my Hegel.
I don't know that I would say I'm besotted, but I read my Hegel.
Oh, I'm besotted. Or I was. Yeah, anyway.
Okay, should we open it up?
yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Should we
You guys and gals still got
should we just keep going?
juice?
We've been 90 minutes in.
But who's counting?
Matt Siegel has a question.
Yeah, and hopefully your
I'll speak up.
dulcet tones will be recorded.
So I'm thinking about the shift in the modern period, so-called Cartesian moment, when
Yeah.
the subject accesses the truth through knowledge, and there's no need to engage in any transformative practices in order to be in the truth.
Yeah.
And how that developed maybe, into the Enlightenment and these values around democracy and equality, and the way that every individual has a right to their opinion, every individual has a right to vote, to shape the laws that govern one's society, and the way that bringing back this ancient sense of spiritual practice as necessary for transforming the self such that one is adequate to the truth.
Yeah.
This notion of arete, excellence, that needs to be cultivated, and that everyone just doesn't get it for free. What is, Adam, you wanted to get into sort of the political dimensions of philosophy as a practice, as a way of life. How does this play out in our modern post-Enlightenment context, where we do maybe value democracy despite some of its shadow dimensions, which we're seeing now. But yeah, how would we reincorporate a sense of that the subjects need to engage in spiritual practice in the context of a democratic society?
John, am I remembering this right, that Edgar Morin says somewhere we need to engage in a training for the vital combat of lucidity?
What a great quote.
I don't remember that verbatim, but
You should take that as your own.
Yeah, why don't you own it?
It's.
Say you were
I think
inspired by
it's. I
Morin.
think it's Morin.
He does talk about the need for a cognitive democracy.
It's Morin, or maybe it's Hadot. Anyway, vital combat for lucidity, and I think this kind of training intersects with the political, like right there, when especially now when there's just so much inundation with information and different narratives and social media streams just kind of constantly. I mean, there's this internal like flow of thoughts and feelings and representations that's always been there and that we've always had to struggle with, but now there's this other one that's coming out from the outside. And to me, this kind of training, this kind of askesis is all about kind of keeping your head on a swivel in that context, and then still finding sort of as best you can the right path forward, and then kind of grabbing people if you see them being pulled in this way or that way. But it's a training for the event, like Foucault was saying, so it's just kind of ongoing.
Yeah, I think democracy presupposes askesis, right? And that's kind of the essential sort of message. But then, again, like, as you said in a lot of conversations, the question is, well, what is the actual practice? So a big one is remembering death, right? We've been talking about training for death. But Foucault points out that shouldn't be thought of as a future-oriented activity, because what it does is it induces one to think about how one is spending one's time right now, because you could die doing whatever it is you're doing. So if you would rather die doing something better than what you're doing, choose that activity now. And then also, yeah, there goes Jay.
No, you can do it right here. Let's find out where he's going.
Yeah, right. Pizza.
Leave crumbs.
It's bowling. I know it's Jake's passion for bowling. And then another one is, I'm trying to remember. I'm blanking on it. But the point is that the meditation on death involves a memory. It's an orientation to what one has done and what one is currently doing. So it's sort of past and present oriented. And the result of it is that one has this heightened sort of moral sense of oneself. And I'm wagering here that democracy sort of presupposes that kind of askesis. But I almost want to bring this into conversation with that psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who theorizes flow states as characteristic of happiness, which is to say that people feel their greatest sense of well-being and happiness when they achieve something or discover something or build something. And if they don't have energy to do that, because it takes a certain initial investment of time and energy to take on a hobby or a sport or whatever, instead people fall into a kind of passive forms of pleasure, like whatever, television or all the various kinds of passive media that we always have in our face all the time. And but then people who do that tend not to have the energy required for true happiness, which is the attainment of flow states in states of achievement, creativity, discovery, etc. And I feel like practices of askesis that involve constantly course correcting and saying, what is it that truly matters to me? What is it that truly secures my happiness? Is relevant here. I feel like a problem is that we think that in order to participate in our democracy, we have to add all these other tasks onto our lives. And so people don't have the bandwidth for it. They're sort of tired at the end of the day and they just want to come home and hear their favorite commentator and then go vote on a certain month. but maybe we could correlate the practices that give rise to meaning and happiness in democracy. Maybe they're sort of a piece.
Just one response quickly. It's not really pushing back or blowback, but it might seem that way. There's a whole tradition, you can call it Marxist with a small m or other things, that said that even if you look at the birth and the use of the term democracy in Athenians, and there are different things, and it wasn't like everybody participated, you had to be a member, etc. All the way up to the present, I'm going to put it radically. There's a profound sense. Is there some sense in which democracy as doctrine or practiced is an exemplification of false consciousness? Meaning, it's hiding actual truths whose contradictions will surface and have surfaced and then are talked about as imperfections of the instantiation of that democracy, etc. We have Bill Moyers, who at a certain point in his career talked about the bought and paid for Congress. We know, now we could say this is corruption, and that there was a time, or maybe it wasn't in our society, another society, where there was kind of an instantiation of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Now we can add the happy. But, and in terms of laws, or you read the People's History of the United States and all of that. Now, my response to that critique that I'm bringing up that people have said is, it's better than anything we had, maybe social, I forget the term that Bernie Sanders used, a kind of democratic socialism or something like that, and if it was included in that. And that's really good, and somebody else said democracy would be a good idea. But anyway, that's just a little thought about the use of that term. So, you guys call on whomever you want.
Beverly and then Jake.
Okay, well, it's sort of the same quote where you said Foucault, said that the modern age begins with the truth being found through knowledge. It feels like it's still standing on only two legs right now, because, as you know, we have, like you mentioned, all the media we have available. We're now dealing with alternate facts and fake news, and so where we get that information has become a problem. And so I know for myself that when I discovered a Buddhist practice, having a practice that included, we call it faith, practice, and study, but you could say care, practice, and study. Having it's like having three legs, and one feeds the other, and it makes, I think that would help adding spiritually, that spiritual element back in, that contemplative part, because I think that's what's missing in this making our democracy fail, is there's not enough contemplation about what we're taking in and accepting as fact. And so to rely only on knowledge, it's hard to know what is knowledge now, it seems to me. You have to spend some time thinking about it, and study. So you need the care, the practice of the study, all of them, in order to make judgments, I think, in the current time period. So I would kind of object to Foucault's analysis, or what.
Like he was limiting it, you mean?
I think, it's like a stool with only two legs. It feels like we need the third element that was taken away.
I think Foucault would agree with you. He I think came close to, if not outright advocated for transformative sort of technologies of the self. He spent a lot of his career talking about how the subject gets produced, or what he calls subjectivation. And it's no coincidence that subject as the experiencer and subject as kind of the one held under the thumb of the rule, of the ruler, is the same word. And for Foucault's whole career, in a way, is kind of tracing that historical process. But then at the end of his life, he started to become very interested in ways that we can kind of appropriate that process of subjectivation for our own becoming and emancipation. So I think that's part of why these books were written, is because there's a sense that there is something important that's been lost in the legacy of ancient philosophy that deserves to be recovered and remains relevant for ourselves today as subjects. And Foucault's trying to bring that out.
When I
as
read
this-
Foucault myself, it's been a number of years now, I had a sense that there was a caring element going
Yeah.
on. But this statement is what I question, what does he mean by knowledge? It
Yeah.
seems to leave it out, but maybe he's just reflecting on what he was observing as occurring.
Yeah, I think it was supposed to be a historical observation about the neglect of askesis as first philosophy. Jake?
I'm going to try to do this briefly, but I've got three strands that I want to sort of pick up on. One is just building on Beverly's comment. I think part of what Foucault is doing in that comment about modernity switching from care to knowledge, he talks about the sort of subsumption of the epimeleia heautu
Right.
by the genothi seauton, right? So that it's all become, philosophy's become about what great people thought, what they knew, as opposed to the practices by which they become a different sort of person. I always read Foucault on that though and think, he was working on this when he died, and it strikes me as actually really kind of shallow when he gets out of antiquity. He jumps over the Middle Ages and then kind of sees a revival of care of the self starting in the 19th century with Hegel and moving forward. But it's hard to read early modernity or the Middle Ages that way if you're careful, right? Like Descartes only arrives at his insights through literally a practice of Stoic meditations. That's what he
Right.
calls it. And it is identical in form to Stoic meditations that he knew and modeled himself on. So right there at the center of the turn to the subject in modernity is a practice. And I think when we don't pay attention to that, we miss what's really powerful about modernity, which is, building on Charles Taylor, is that we created a new type of self. And in order to create a new type of self, you needed a different sort of technology that involves engaging, forging yourself through different sorts of practices. And so that gets me to my second point, which is we might want to talk about not just philosophy as spiritual practice, or care of the soul, or care of the self, but a variety of ways of caring. So that Matt's question about the elitism involved in a certain kind of care of the self applies really directly to Plato, who thought that the care of the soul, the care of the self, was for men and women, he was egalitarian in that sense, who were selected to be guardians, but not for anyone else. This is to train people who would have the job of ruling. And when you don't train people that way, you get, I don't know, reality stars. But it's actually a great case study because Plato's point is this is not for all of us in this room to pick up on. It's like Plato would look at us in this room and say, look, if you're not already doing it, pretty much all of us are screwed. It's the kind of thing you have to start doing when you're young, because by the time you get past a certain age, Plato seemed to think somewhere around the mid-30s, it's basically baked in. You're not going to change a whole lot after that. So he thought. The Stoics thought about it differently. The Stoics thought that this kind of practice was completely egalitarian, and it could cut across class, cut across responsibility, cut across age. And so they had a different set of practices that were intended to produce a different kind of conformity, right? It wasn't intended to be to cultivate rulers. It was intended to cultivate the capacity to respond to whatever the event might be. Anyway, so those are some of the strands that were kind of chasing through my head as I was listening to this. We might want to distinguish one sort of Foucault's reading of the history of this thing, as if you could ever stop doing philosophy as care of the self. It's always a kind of care of the self. It's just sometimes the practices of care we engage in are forming selves that we don't really want to form, it seems to me. And then we want to distinguish between these various types of care that are out there and be more intentional about it. Like what kind of care are we cultivating in the kind of practice of philosophy we're engaging in? I've sometimes warned people, I got this sense when I was studying philosophy as an undergraduate, I noticed that, I spent a fair amount of time doing analytic philosophy. I took my training in logic, etc. But I remember trying to warn myself and warn other people to be careful, because I saw a lot of people go and become analytic philosophers and become a lot worse people. Like literally, they moved from kind of compassionate, kinder people to kind of asses, right? And so, and that's a kind of care of the self
Yeah.
that philosophical practice was engaged in. That was bound up with all sorts of pedagogical issues and things like that.
So does that tradition thematize such practices of formation?
Which tradition?
The analytic one that you're describing.
No, it doesn't. It has, until recently, it has not reflected on them. Although it's consciously cultivated and passed them on, right? So,
Right.
So I have a mentor who was trained by A.J. Ayer.
Yeah.
And she would describe being in Ayer's philosophy seminars, in which Ayer would gather a group of us like this in there, and would throw out some philosophical problems, and then you'd all go at each other with them. And Ayer would literally take the people who were doing better and come and pull them up so they would sit next to him. And he would push to the farther end of the circle the people who got refuted or schooled by others. And then at the end of it, he would walk out with the person who had triumphed over the others. Well, that's a philosophical practice.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a deep form of cultivation and formation that I'm sure is intentional on his part.
Yeah.
But it wasn't, and it was intentional it was coordinated with what the ideal of knowledge was taken to be
Yeah.
also, right? So in that sense, I think it is, it's not absent, it's just a
Right.
bad kind of philosophical approach, right?
Please do.
I have a lot of questions about this because the criticism you just raised of Foucault is the same one that Hadot raises to Foucault and says, look, I get what you're saying by identifying Descartes as this moment, but then he says, well, if we look at Descartes and read him in this way, then it's not true at all of Descartes and his practices. These are meditations in exactly the way that
Precisely.
we think of meditations. And so at the same time, when Foucault kind of gives this history, I can see people for who that's true, and books and courses and conferences that are kind of organized around that idea or that reading that Foucault has, which isn't unique to him. They're organized around that being true. And then when Hadot comes to Descartes and Hadot uses his resources to read him, you get a different Descartes, and then he does the same thing with Kant and Montaigne and Bergson, and you go through this whole list and you're like, oh, we're doing really well actually. We didn't fall away from anything. This is good. There's all these major figures that are practicing in this sense that we're upholding right now. But I keep going back and forth because it's what Foucault is saying seems to be true of a certain culture. But then Hadot seems to have a richer reading. So is it just how we're reading these figures, or?
I see the big difference as being the people that Hadot's picking up on as recovering, or the great figures that he's highlighting, and the reason why Foucault sees it coming back in the 19th century is because the connection between epimania and knowledge is reestablished, so that like when Ayer's engaging in a certain pedagogy, and he got better later in his life. That was kind of a certain Ayer. He had a near-death experience, and by all accounts was a really compassionate guy afterwards. But that kind of experience was tied to certain philosophical skills, but it wasn't tied to what you described earlier as certain access conditions, right? And I think that's the distinction that Foucault is trying to get at with spirituality. I just think he didn't work it out. I mean, I don't think it's Foucault's error. He was in the middle of trying to work this out, and he died. But the notion of spirituality is that there's certain kinds of truth that one has to be equal to, right? It's actually, the medievals talked about it all the time. They called it principles of adequatio. That there's certain kinds of knowledge, certain kinds of things that we can only know if we are cultivated in the right way to meet them, to resonate with them rightly, if we approach them in the right demeanor, with the right mode of approach. That's not thematized in modernity until you get to some of those figures you're talking about, right? Like Bergson thinks that way, or Goethe thinks that way. People that we like here think that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I think it's establishing that not just being self-conscious about the practices that one is engaging in are intentional, but seeing those practices as having a direct link to the transformation of knowledge that's possible. Or even, the way I like to talk about it is I think our reasoning capacities are transformed.
Mm-hmm.
I think our capacity to find reasons intelligible is transformed depending on the kind of practices we engage in. So that it's, if you don't think of reason as a static, eternally identical kind of procedural norm, then we cultivate different capacities to see the rationality of each other in cultivating these different practices.
I can't see if other people have their hands up.
You were called on that, so.
I don't know Hadot's work, so I can't, but forgive me. But what, or Foucault for that matter. I mean, I've only skirted them. But we've heard about truth.
Yeah.
That it sort of begs the question, what is truth? What I got from what seems clear to me, and what was a bridge between the askesis, the practice of askesis, whether it's the Platonic or the Stoic form, or, and Buddhist soteriology, and the Christian soteriological preoccupation with liberation, is one could say is freedom. So, following Foucault's recommendation to turn to Hegel, who characterizes the evolution of consciousness and the philosophy of history as, and the history of philosophy and the philosophy of history both as the progressive actualization of the principle of freedom, as one reading of what the what it's all about, like what is trying to happen, what's wanting to happen. That's one version of it. Now he also says, as you know, in the preface to the phenomenology, that the true is the whole.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So if we say, what is the whole? So here we have wholeness and freedom as two alternative incarnations. They're just words, but I mean, if the words point to allow access to some kind of intuition or a shared willing of a value that we recognize when we hear the words freedom and wholeness, then that's a start, it seems to me.
Mm-hmm.
And what I like about the Hegelians, since you invited me, or Stephen, to show my love for that tradition, that I don't quite see, or maybe it's there in Hadot, or in the ancient tradition as much until it fulfills itself in Hegel. I could say. Where it's not only a love of wisdom, but it's actual wisdom. So it's not just seeking wisdom. Is that finally there's a coherent articulation, a complete speech, as Kojève put it, around the intuition of wisdom, as wholeness, as freedom, which by definition cannot just be concerned for the self. Of course it's concerned for the self, but the self, as you said, problematizing it, Stephen, is not separate from or other than the world. The self is the world is all of ourselves, and so on. So there's no solitary liberation, there's no solitary awakening. It can only truly happen as all beings, sentient beings. I'm going back and forth between the Buddhist and so this is what I would like to see in terms of philosophy of spiritual practice. It would be making more explicit what the telos, the goal is, and indications of how we would recognize its actualization, which I know the Buddhist tradition has a lot of, but in the Western philosophical tradition, I only see it once we get to somebody like Hegel, who will say that there is no wisdom apart from its, however provisional and imperfect, instantiation in the polis, in the state, in our way of being together as a community. So.
Thank you for that. So now to argue on the side of democracy, coming back to Matt's point, and happiness, eudaimonia, Jeremy Bentham and others while, at least on paper, they were forging some way to come up with know-how for democracy, let's say, in Britain. So they came up with a thing that they called the philosophic calculus. That is to say, well, we don't want people to suffer. Suffering's bad. So maybe happiness is the absence of suffering. But how do we know? Is it just somebody saying, oh, I'm no longer suffering? Or people saying to them, you got all this stuff, so you're not really suffering. How do you calculate? What's the calculus of Felix, happiness? And so they actually had these formulas. And I don't know if anybody's, the philosophical radicals were looking at this. And then a modern version of this, and I wonder if it ever gets actually quoted. Bhutan, even though they're suppressing the hell out of Nepalese who were there, but at least this doctrine, like doctrine of democracy, has an idea of gross national happiness. So this happiness, I mean, they tried to say, well, it's not hedonistic. So maybe the good, the true, and the beautiful, there's a kind of convergence with what might be happiness. Against that, we have medieval notions of, we say, soteriology, and it's pretty clear that there's a major read that says being human, the summation of that at the end is not to be happy, but to be saved. And there's a great French social historian, Demilieu, who wrote a history of sin and guilt from the 11th to the 18th century. And he says, again, so this is back to the know thyself, there were medieval doctrines that said, well, not doctrines, sayings in the countryside, know thyself, so this is against happiness or hedonistic greed. Know thyself so you'll come to see what a truly despicable creature you are, and therefore will be motivated to throw yourself on the mercy of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ.
Right.
So, in a way, so we have scourging, right? In a way, I'm going to suggest that a way to read the seemingly masochistic or sadistic, depending what side of the whip you're on, practices. Well, it'd be masochistic in a way because you're doing it to yourself. You don't find on the bulletin board in the monastery, please scourge me. You know, you're supposed to be doing it yourself. It's a way of loosening, of getting ready to get rid of or prepare for really, really wishing to be free. So.
Which is to renounce oneself, is what I'm hearing.
Yes, to renounce the
Renounce
self.
oneself.
Yeah, to renounce the one self that's my current version of not being totally free.
Yeah.
Well, here's a little question. Let's say we're, as Jack Kerouac once said, safe in heaven, dead. Okay, that's in Mexico City Blues. You know, we always have that as the goal, you know, or to be in the kingdom of God, and are you on the left side or the right side, and there's different doctrines. What happens to any version of the self, the work through self, the exercise self, the knowing, caring self, if you are saved, if you are in heaven? The Buddhist traditions have a crazy amount of stuff that talk about the qualities. You completely, people can pray to you, they can, if you're Buddha, you could get all kinds of sustenance, And you say, well, if you're a saint, then in fact, at least the Catholic tradition, there's a communion of saints, right? And you can pray to them, and you can get help on the way in this world. My question is, what kind of self does anybody know? I'm a lapsed Unitarian, so I question everything. In what sense can we say that there's a self of any sort if you made it to heaven?
Well, presupposes, you know, we mean by making it to heaven.
Well, no, what I mean is, I'm trying to see, I should quote chapter and verse, but you could have an evangelical thing, you're saved, you quote, you're in heaven, or is it the you that's in heaven? I'm just asking about, however we got there, if there's a getting there, what about the self? So, Jake.
I don't want to dominate the conversation.
No, just clarify.
But just as a general rule, for the vast majority of Orthodox Christian writers, the answer would be, yeah, there's a self in heaven. Or heaven being a difficult term there, because the technical Christian eschatological hope is not to go away to heaven, but that heaven and earth will be united in the
Okay, but you're
resurrection
free
of
then,
things.
forget about the placement.
Yeah.
So what do they say about that self?
Well, it's a self that's continuous with this self, but as different from it as a tree is different from an acorn. So
That doesn't help me. Confuses stuff.
yes,
It's
but-
like if I take all of my tendencies in this world where I'm completely fucked up as an acorn, all of my fuck ups blossom in heaven.
yes.
Make
well,
many more acorns.
That would be the other place, Stephen. That would be
Oh, I see.
No, I think the things that you would think about sanctity and about transformation, and finally about love being the one thing that endures, right? So St. Paul's notion of what are called the evangelical virtues, faith, hope, and love. The greatest of these is love, because love alone will endure. You know, where there's faith, faith will pass away. Where there's hope, hope will find fulfillment. But love alone will endure. And so it's the ideal picture of a transformed self is a self transformed in the image of love, which the Christian tradition took to be the image of Christ, right? So that St. John says, love one another, little brothers. We do not know what we will be like, but we know that we will be like him.
Mhm.
Speaking of Christ, in the same letter in which he goes on to say, God is love. That's the entire verse, right? So then I think that's because that gets back to this question of like, when you're cultivating the self, and this is something I'm really interested in, is when you're cultivating the self, what is the image of self you're cultivating?
Yeah.
And I think with Foucault, it's sometimes willful.
Right.
You choose what kind of self to cultivate. I think in the ancient world, for Plato, it's a self whose image is defined by both the cosmos and the city, because the city is the image of the self writ large, and the self is the image, ideally, of the cosmos writ small, right? It's the whole microcosm, macrocosm thing. And so so much is bound up with what the goal of these exercises, these transformations. I mean, I loved Adam's image of, doing a bunch of exercises and then getting your ass handed to you in the ring, because the exercises themselves don't produce the character. The character is something that you aim at and cultivate in other ways. The exercises are brought in as tools. And that's why I think a lot of these exercises can be shared across traditions that aim at very different images of the self, very different images of community. And so that's, slowly gets into a lot of this, right? Thinking about it in that we're all engaged in these practices.
Right.
So we had some hands earlier. I don't know if they're still fresh. We had Bennett. I saw William and Laura make gestures. So,
Yeah, you have a question.
and then
I
this
have
is-
one comment that
Okay.
I would like to just kind of drop into the room, and then anybody else who has thoughts about it could just add to it. But especially the quote you gave about know thyself so that you can know what did you use? Scourge?
Know thyself so you can come to know what a truly despicable person
Yeah.
you are, and therefore be motivated to throw yourself at the mercy of the true loving God, Jesus Christ.
So the applicability of these methods is, I think,
This is
what I want to
medieval. That
bring
was
out,
medieval.
right? Of
Yeah.
the way that they can be appropriated by power systems and then used. And so that's just something that I think is a really important part of this conversation, because if philosophy is, right, a way of knowing, and we can look at a way of knowing oneself, right, and we could maybe loosely look at religion as a way of knowing God, perhaps. And we've seen how inappropriately religion has been used by power systems, and the efficiency of that in a negative sense. And so bringing in the part of telos, and where is this all headed, and what is that vision? Because as a technique or as a skill set, it can be used in any manner of ways. And we've seen it potentially at that modern point. Now we had maybe started to see it be used in a way that was very different from the classical self, potentially more problematic or negative or soulless or less spiritual. So I just want to kind of put that in, and maybe you guys can respond, or anybody else who has responses can also share.
It's something I think about a lot, actually.
Yeah.
Just the multiple ways these practices and insights can be used. We were talking about alternative facts earlier, and I see just the weight of being able to use a framework like that coming on the back of a lot of good research, dismantling, scientific ideological systems of power that oppress certain people based on facts, and revealing those facts to not be facts but to be racist kind of ideologies, and then proving the contextuality and the contingency and the paradigmatic components of scientific research, and all of those things are valuable and good and true, but then seeing the opportunity to grab that set of moves and say, okay, well, climate change, guess what? Just a perspective. All of these things, and so all of a sudden it's you have your facts and I have my facts, and I see it coming out of a pretty sophisticated set of practices and insights and important historical work just spun around and then used just right back against the people who developed it. So I think about what's, in terms of counter practice, what are the counter practices to that move? How do you recognize the contingency of something like science and argue for the reality of climate change?
And the contingency of tradition. I mean, one of the things that orients these various practices and gives them their direction is tradition, right? If you're practicing magic without doing it inside of a tradition like Christianity, then you're risking, black magic and moral stain and insanity and all those things. Whereas if you have a kind of orienting vision of the good provided by a tradition, then you're sort of safe. But then I like to think of myself as a kind of left traditionalist. I think that tradition is important, and I try to argue for it. And this is one of the ways that I've found of trying to argue for it, this whole discourse that we're in right now. But I'm left in the sense that I'm, committed to this kind of pluralism about it. And I don't have that all figured out, but that's what your question brings up for me.
One quick response, and thank you for bringing it up. I think, we've got false facts, stuff made up, etc. Where in the ancient world would you look for writings that might address such things? And my favorite go-to thing, and I just recommend people read it for the first, second, third, or fourth time, is Aristotle's Rhetoric, the Art of Persuasion, and actually see in what way is there a moral good embedded in what Aristotle's saying about rhetoric, the art of persuasion. Are you coaxing people toward the good, the true, or the beautiful? And we know there were all kinds of, I don't know what the Greek or Latin is for SOBs, politicians who weren't always, yeah.
Right.
Right. So I think that, and you were talking about fake news. The thing that we're leaving out of that is persuasion, and there's a long history, like since the polis, of people. It's in contention, and there's different voices, and we may have a naive idea that one person, one vote, etc. Well, that's certainly not the case. And is a populace who is the recipient of these persuasive offerings that gullible and they believe this stuff? Well, the answer is yes.
Yeah, fake news is parasitic on an impulse to be always confirmed, and on the other hand, inflamed.
But what I want to say is that opposition and fakeness is as ancient as civilization, and we have the history of all of that, as is collecting information. I'm one of the few people who's not totally freaked out by Cambridge Analytica. Ever since, because, in fact, I figured that if I'm on the grid, people are following my stuff. Now, if I become a bomb thrower, which was Nietzsche's definition of a good philosopher, I'm going to get off the grid, right? But now you can say there's degrees of that. But ever since there was a census, what was the reason for the census in the ancient world? To have representative democracy? I don't think so. Yeah, so anyway, that's just 2 cents. Yeah, Bennett?
So Castaneda talks about one of the most important issues of Toltec mysticism being that of the point of perception.
Right.
And he calls this the assemblage point.
Right.
He goes on to say that any movement, any shift or adjustment of this assemblage point does feel like dying. And there's sort of 2 aspects by which this assemblage point moves, and 2 aspects that are to be made aware in that lineage. One of them is to notice any perceptual shift that then redefines the world that you're perceiving, and therefore the world that exists in front of you. So there's a certain death that happens in lieu of this assemblage point being moved by a certain sort of external phenomenon. And another aspect about competency with this assemblage point is being able to adjust that. And so I guess my first question would be, in what ways do we engage with death such that we receive a certain proximity to it, such that we can see how this death holds a certain gravity to the way in which we're perceiving the world and the world that we're creating because of that? And in what ways do we kind of use death as a means to shift our own assemblage point to adjust the way that we see the world sort of manually with intention? And then moving on to compassion, how do we kind of use compassion, or how does compassion involve itself with a sort of sense of responsibility when affecting other people's assemblage points, when causing a kind of perceptual death in someone else and in yourself?
Yeah, I don't remember the text where I think the Buddha himself said the greatest thought of all thoughts is impermanence. The best thing you could ever think about is impermanence. And when you really take in the significance of impermanence, then a lot of virtues sort of smoothly follow from that, and your life tends to get simpler. So I do think that there's ways that you could translate the Castaneda jargon you were using there pretty straightforwardly, I think.
Mm-hmm.
The thought of impermanence is a profound reassemblage, or it makes it possible. And there's more we could say about compassion. I know Stephen has a lot you can say about that.
Just a footnote on Castaneda. First of all, it's great to hear that. I don't know if anybody's reading Castaneda now, but back in the day, everybody went OMG. Particularly, there was a strand that said he's making this stuff up.
Mm-hmm.
He's not putting his anthropological field notes on file at UCLA and what's going on here. But everybody that I hung out with, who was in some sense involved in, maybe deluded or otherwise, a program of self-overcoming, having a teacher or teaching and stuff, felt the sting of truth in the dynamic between a disciple and the teacher. And so in this, we talked about a spiritual friend, and then in democracy, are there hierarchies within democracy, or some people more democratic instantiation than others? Well, if you have representative, maybe supposedly people like them, so they'll represent. I don't know. But Castaneda had this notion of a twofold way in which a teacher might present themselves. One is kind of how you perceive them, or the world perceives them, and it's as if people can have access to their experience of the teacher's assemblage points, let's just say. Because Castaneda says everything is the same. And that's the tonal, the T-O-N-A-L. But he said, but there's another dimension which is always hidden, and that's the Nabwa. And he's 2 in 1. It's sort of like, so let's say that's the truth, and you want to train in the truth. There's the truth of, let's say, the sensei who's giving you martial arts. Okay, you're doing practices, you do battle and stuff, but then there's something about the sensei or Zifu Rinpoche where there's a hidden dimension, and it's not like they're purposefully hiding it, but that hiddenness is rather essential. The opposite of that, if it's truth, is this warning shot of Bentham and then others, Foucault, of the panopticon. That is to say, what is true or allowable has to be overtly open to surveillance and knowledge. You have to tell us everything, and what's true is what you're truly thinking, etc. So the hidden dimension, and Derrida's written about this, we might say it's an unknowability, but it's got the force of truth and stuff. So it's a dynamic that we haven't really talked about.
Bennett Hadot, you might enjoy this quote, says, "Philosophy is nothing other than an exercise of death. Melite thanato."
Mm-hmm. Melite is a word for exercise?
Melite, I think, is actually, I was just looking it up, is like contemplation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanato is death, so it's like a death contemplation exercise.
Notice people are fleeing as we focus on death.
Yeah. Well, we've been going for a long time. Does anybody have a final questions or?
It was William, and then one over here.
I just was going to comment on that gentleman's idea, so it may have no relevance anymore.
But
Still relevant.
And it was actually, it's about practice and what do you do and what is the practice? What the question that you had asked. And also the sense of, here you are doing these exercises individually, and then you're thrown into a crowd and you're kind of useless. But I also want to say that, meditation practice or any kind of practice, you can follow the rules or the regulations or whatever they say, but then there's a certain point where you have to kind of make it up and do it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And it demands a certain kind of spontaneity right there in the spot that allows you to jump into the world and make it work. And you kind of find out what you have to do by doing it yourself, and designing it yourself. So even if you're in a tradition, you have to do that.
Yeah.
So just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, that's true.
What I was going to bring up had really started getting discussed a lot, and it was first thought, I think it's pretty telling that Descartes was doing deep meditations. I mean, Descartes, I don't know, so he was doing Stoic meditations, and he ended up, torturing dogs. I mean, he was also a genius, but some of the things that he was doing and the ideas that he was coming up with, like these other living things, or just or just machines, etc. I mean, like the darker aspects of that that's really telling that you can come up with that even through deep meditation. And so I think what was being talked about was that these are strong tools. You had mentioned that someone that's a little bit more attained spiritually still has an actually a greater capacity to do harm. And so I think that it's really and this is something I brought up at at Bishop's Ranch this past retreat, which is where's the place for, I agree with you that there has to still be this place for tradition, because if we're all just going it alone, if it's this kind of like anarchistic democracy, even though I believe kind of in anarchism, if we're just all going it alone in terms of the meditation practices and our spiritual practices and philosophy practices, like there's no guarantee that you're going to end up in a good place.
Of
And
course,
so,
that's true with traditions.
well, sure, but I mean, like, but that's the paradox,
Yeah.
you know, like the tradition itself can be hijacked, like you were saying,
Mhm.
but then without a tradition, like, where's the guide, you know?
Well, even
So-
within it, I might expect to end up in a bad place at some point.
Wait, say that again?
Even within a tradition, I think you might expect to end up in a bad place. You know, I read that quote from Hadot where he was basically saying, this is going to turn your life upside down.
Mhm.
If you're doing this right, it's going to mess up your relationships with your friends, your family, your community. And then maybe there's like a kind of a recuperation and a coming to a different set of relations with those people, but maybe not. But it's going to mess you up.
But isn't that where the role of the mentor or the
Yeah,
special
but the
friend
men-
comes in,
a
because
good-
they'll keep you back on track when you start going
A
on?
good mentor will pull the rug out just at the point that you thought you got it together. I mean, we have the dark night of the soul. I mean, there are certain modern things that say in this workshop you will learn how to tra-la, tra-la into the infinite light. I'd say save your money, you know.
So there's two different things that he raised. I mean, I'm reminded there are many stories in Hindu mythology of yogis doing ascetic practice for eons of time and accruing massive power and then unbalancing the cosmos such that the gods need to assemble into Kali or something so that the situation can be put right. So there's a long tradition of...
Are we going to have a separate panel on Heidegger next, or...?
Yeah, let's do that. There's a long cognizance that those practices can be decoupled from morality, and by doing them, you accrue more personal power and charisma. So that is a real issue, and that's separate from the way that the guru ruins your life.
Well,
Because the guru
Yeah.
ruins your
expectations.
Yeah. The guru ruins all of the things you do to prevent life from occurring.
It's supposedly the last gasp of your naive, egoistic clinging to what should be the path. Honest, go ahead.
Well, I was only going to say that one of the criteria that I find a lot when I run across these discussions in Buddhism, like how do you assess a potential teacher, is are they compassionate or not? I mean, ideally, they should be completely acquainted with the nature of reality as such. But since we live in the end times, it's extremely rare to find anyone who is truly qualified in that sense. And so one of the criteria that you should always look at is how do they treat people? I guess there's a sort of common sense there. I don't know.
There's, coming back to Askesis, because we were talking about, I guess ascetic practice is a way of translating that.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's seen as maybe spiritually wholesome privation.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a term, several terms in the Buddhist tradition that talk about as one is engaged in some kind of practice of compassion, etc., of renunciation. In an interview with Bertolucci, after he made the film The Little Buddha, and he was talking about Dzogchen Khyentse Rinpoche, he said, I asked him, now this was a very difficult film project, are you going to go on a retreat? Because renunciation is a big deal in your tradition, right? And Zonzo Kensei said, yeah, people say that, but I'm in a tradition, you might call it Tantra, although that's got a bad name, that the much more difficult practice is the practice of the renunciation of renunciation. And then Bertolucci goes, whoa. So there's a lot of radical practices and views that support it that are usually been kept secret in India, but somehow they're leaking out into the West. And they question or deepen what is meant by ascetic practice, and also what is the goal. And there's books written that say the journey itself is the goal. You know, you're as you go. We have that in some of the even more popular Zen traditions. You know, you just sit there. This enlightenment idea is just a fantasy. It kind of got you to really engage in self-overcoming. But
yeah, at the fruition of the practice, you realize that the practice was never necessary. But it took all that practice to get to that point.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's just for future things, and we can talk about that in a I guess a shorter version of a Heidegger thing. You know. If nothing else, if y'all are encouraged to go read some Hadot or Foucault or any of the ancient folks, party on. You know, there's some really good stuff there. Anyone else? Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot. Yeah.
Totally. It feels like this discussion is like highly relevant to what's going on in academia right now, and what is the future of academia in terms of, you know, are universities supposed to be centers for research, kind of detached from moral considerations, or are they supposed to be places of activism and social change? And are these things incompatible? Because I think there's like a very hot discussion about that right now. You know, it's like there's actually this thing called Heterodox Academy that a few, you know, people started to kind of rank universities in terms of how orthodox they are in terms of their morality. Like, is it okay to dissent? Is it okay to be a Republican there? Or, you know, like, or are you going to be ashamed? Or are people walking on eggshells? And is that, you know, like the idea being that this is going to be contrary to the first purpose of academia, which is to further knowledge. So, like, the dichotomy between knowledge and care can be very present in that discussion. So I think that I'm wondering, like, how you would apply this idea of philosophy as a practice to academia specifically in the future of
Well, I mean,
universities.
I have a sort of romantic idea of the university as a place where the culture is transmitted. Like, the world as understood by the culture is presented in accord with all the various disciplines that have been developed. But then, so there's a tradition that's being transmitted, but part of that tradition is this whole Socratic imperative, which is not doctrinal in nature, but rather really pushing and saying, what do you actually know here? So there is a sweet spot there between doctrine. I mean, tradition is not the same as doctrine. It's like a tradition of inquiry. There's also the cultural legacy, like the canonical works of Western literature. I don't know, it's sometimes troubling for me when I hear that folks who are pushing for a more emancipatory curriculum think that it's oppressive to have folks read some of the key works of kind of standard culture, the Platonic dialogues or the Bible or something. But the problem with not studying those things is that if you don't do that, then you won't understand many of the references and images and idioms of all the centuries of this conversation. So we have a responsibility as educators to bring people into that in the spirit of a kind of questioning inquiry. And it's not clear which sort of political position is favored by that. Although sometimes, like the Texas Republican Party was pretty specific in their platform that they want students not to question their parents' authority, and so the curriculum should be designed so that that authority never gets questioned. I think that is poison and actually is anti-educational. And I think we could make arguments for it just in the way that I did. You could transmit our noble traditions in a way that allows for continuing inquiry and questioning and maybe rebellion.
On that point, here's an analogy. What we're doing here, maybe not just today, but we're engaged perhaps unconsciously in some version of fiddling while Rome burns. What do I
Fiddling
mean?
what?
Fiddling. That's an old thing, like Rome's burning, but let's make some music.
Oh.
There's an argument that has been made that universities as a place of learning, they've never been under greater threat. If you're in the sciences, it's great, STEM. Not just religious studies, but humanities in Asia, in North America, in Europe. One by one, there has grown a almost an apparatchik, bureaucratic mentality that unless professors or departments can show that they will be getting X amount of money, then they're going to cut courses, they're going to cut departments, whole departments, and we can wring our hands and feel bad about that. I don't see this trend changing, and particularly schools like ours, unlike Stanford that has an endowment of north of $1 billion, we sink or swim based on the tuition of students. But let's be real. Maybe you're all trust fund babies, but largely, I don't know what percentage of students at CIIS are on financial aid.
96 or something.
So upwards of 90%?
Yeah.
So I'm just saying this, and it's on the record. I think that's an obscenity that nobody's addressing. And with false faith, I continue to teach, but I think with every click, the students that I'm teaching are going into more and more debt. So you voluntarily or not become slaves. And it's like a form of corvée. We have your labor, your money, and that allows us to live in the mansion. So I have some unmild views about that. And we once had a faculty meeting, and Judy Wexler, who was provost, and said, what would make your job as a professor easier? I said, it's simple. Much more money, not debt, but money for students. You ever noticed how a lot of mental and emotional illness clears up if the person gets a job in housing? Okay?
Yeah.
We had to institute emergency available funds for students who would go without eating so that they could attend classes. So anyway, that's just a mild response on my part. I think your question is very central.
Well, that's a different version of something that I was going to kind of respond to, is that when you have to try so hard to get educated, what you get educated with becomes so much more important. And it shouldn't be a problem to read Plato, but because you have to fight to read it, or you have to go into debt to read it, or you have to be in just the right location with just the right parents and just the right, then that knowledge becomes privileged in a way that it doesn't necessarily need to be. And so it would be great if we could all just read the canon and it just be part of our knowledge base. And then we could enrich it with the things that do matter, like these other perspectives from different cultures and different civilizations. But we don't have that luxury right now. And so there is that fear of when it becomes such a privilege, what you're offering has more power. But that's kind of related, right?
Yes, it is.
What's curious to me, it's not curious to me, but I'll bring it up, that a lot of the sort of social justice questions that are framed and put out by liberal universities often admit class analysis. class analysis kind of, I forgot who said this quote too, but you can celebrate all kinds of diversity except class diversity.
Especially in higher education.
Especially in higher education. So there's something about class that's a little bit different than some of the other issues of diversity that we deal with. But I have to look at it in a different way because I'm kind of on the opposite end of the timeline as Stephen. I am in a lot of debt. I am still a young person. I am still working to get a degree. I'm not going to work in a university. Even if they stay alive, I'm not going to work in a university coming from this school probably. So I have to look at creating something different. And I think a lot of these universities and humanities programs will fold, but I think the schools and the traditions and the practices will find another way to organize themselves, but it won't be what they look like now, and they might actually look more like they did in ancient Greece with these kinds of people that Hadot is talking about. And there are a lot of pros and cons to that, which means that I may have to go and find myself a wealthy patron to support me and convince that person that they should give me some money so I can teach privately or something like that. But I have to think about it that way, and I have to think about what's optimistic in that picture. And I think there are a lot of things that are optimistic about that picture if you can get it to work. And that's kind of where I'm at on it, and just seeing kind of some of the slow-moving massive bureaucracies of universities kind of try and shift and adapt to what's happening in the rest of the world in technology and all of these things. I kind of look and see spaces of possibility where a smaller organization can make moves that a university can't, and that could maybe support me and a couple of people I like, and can still have the outreach and the access to as many, if not more people than a university could, especially a university press, which I don't understand how they still operate on the model that they do. So I look at them and I just think maybe we can just destroy these things and create something new, because I have to think that way.
Anybody here, just as a footnote on what Adam said, were you, I suppose I should say are you, but were you involved in any of the Occupy movements? Yeah.
A little bit.
So nobody here, Aaron was, but you remember Occupy, right? Remember going to stuff. So there was a term, remember Wilson and others, like an Island of Hope called, what was it? Temporary autonomous zones.
Right.
An anarchist notion.
Mm-hmm.
And we have the slogan, act locally. Think globally, act locally. I mean, most people I know, if you look at some version of the global scene, depending on what you focus on, it's pretty dismal. Just in a class yesterday, Kia, who's in ecology, said, well, I think the most catastrophic thing that's going to happen, climate change is happening, it's actually going to cause this, but her read on the polar ice caps falling off and melting is that in terms of a timeline, that'll be raising oceans in her read of stuff quicker than any other insane, awful thing that's going on. And yeah, so you know the old thing about how to make God laugh, tell him your plans, right?
But it's not fiddling while Rome burns to have this conversation with the sea levels rising.
Oh no, not what we're doing here.
Yeah.
Actually, thank you for that.
Yeah, that would be.
It's not having such conversations. It would be fiddling.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
Or
I agree.
refusing ever to have them. I'm not begrudging entertainment. It's not like we always have to be
But the house is on
monkish.
fire.
But yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like the world's dying. What are you going to do? I'm going to learn Tibetan and read 13th century texts that are crucially important.
Well,
I mean, that's a real response of mine
I
to
know.
our situation, very directly.
my favorite movie on what we can do, which focuses on depression, but also an asteroid coming to wipe out the planet. Very cheery movie called Melancholia. I highly recommend it if you didn't see it.
I've heard of it, yeah.
Anybody see the film? Melancholia? Didn't show at the Grand Lake? Probably a bummer, yeah.
I like that other one with Steve Carell. What's the girl's name? Same plot. They die.
Oh.
It's a comedy.
Well, the world
die.
ends.
They die.
The world actually ends. But it doesn't end in the way that one would think it's going to end. So they really played with it. So, bang or whimper.
So there it is.
Yeah. So temporarily we're here. We can celebrate that. A teacher of mine who had suddenly an illness he had to deal with said, of course everything's impermanent, but if I can live one more day, and that gives me the opportunity to give people hope so that they can address, change, or modify their envelope of suffering, it's worth it. Whatever day by day. So nobody quotes Jesse Jackson, so we'll end with this. Keep your eye on the prize, keep hope alive, and thanks for showing up. Thanks for the co-organizers.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for coming.
No worries.
I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Connor.